Welcome everybody to the webinar. Now, before I introduce our guest, Jess Goldfinch is co-hosting with us tonight. I'm going to let Jess introduce herself, and then I'll tell you a bit about myself before we introduce Mia, who you've all come to hear. So Jess, do you want to say hi?
Hi, good evening, everyone. And I have to say, it's a privilege to be here. I'm not firing on all cylinders, so I do have lots of aid memoir in front of me. My name is Jessica Goldfinch, and some people will recognise the fact that I am on the Green Party Women's Committee, and I've been a member of the Green Party for 22 years. However, tonight I am here not as a representative of the party in any way, shape or form. I'm here as a concerned mother and concerned citizen. After 4 decades of interest in psychology, child and adolescent development and dementia care mapping and research, particularly around the areas of social contagion, which we will define later on this evening, and its sort of little partner in institutions called runaway diffusion. There'll be links and resources in the follow-up email when we have the recording available. So I didn't want to renege on tonight, and I hope we will learn a lot and have a good exchange of ideas. Thank you.
Thanks, Jess. My name's Emma Bateman, and I was in the Green Party. I'm currently expelled. I've been expelled 3 times. I'm waiting to see whether they're going to let me have an appeal so they can expel me a 4th time, but we'll see about that one. I'm pleased to be a member of the Green Women's Declaration, because women's sex-based rights are so important to us all. We've been fighting so hard, and we're not about to give them up, are we? Anyway, so I'm going to just introduce Mia. Mia Hughes has done some brilliant work on what's called the WPATH files. Now, Mia is an English woman living in Canada, and she became involved in the battle of sex and gender after reading JKR's thoughtful essay on how being female shaped her life and identity. So that's just one more thing we have to thank J.K. Rowling for. Mia Hughes got involved after that essay. Don't we love J.K. Rowling? Now, Mia is the author of the WPATH files. For those who are unaware, WPATH is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. And up until recently, it was held by itself, at least, to be the world leading authority on transgender health. WPATH publishes the standards of care, which are supposed to outline the best practices for transgender healthcare. So I'm just going to hand you over now. And so, Mia, if you can tell us a bit about how you came to write the WPATH files and a bit more about your work, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me and for that lovely introduction. A couple of corrections, though, first, before I go any further. It's Mia. My name is Mia. And it was J.K. Rowling's December 19th, 2019 tweet that got me involved in the debate, reading the tweet, and then from that point on I was involved. So let's see, how did I get involved in the WPATH files? So the WPATH files are internal communications from the World Professional Association for Transgender Health's internal messaging forum. And so after I became involved in the gender debate, I was tweeting, and then I got a job covering gender with the Post Millennial. And then from there, I got a job with Michael Schellenberger, and I was covering gender for Michael for his Substack Public. And a couple of weeks after he hired me, he was given the WPATH files by an internal source or sources. So we first tried to turn them into a series of articles. I don't know how many people have read the files, but those stacks and stacks, hundreds and hundreds of pages of internal messaging. And so attempts to turn it into articles didn't work at all. So then Michael moved me over to his think tank, well, his nonprofit that at the time was called Environmental Progress. Now it's called Civilization Works. And that's where I turned the internal communications into a 70-page think tank report that puts the medical puts WPATH, tells the whole story of WPATH and the wider medical scandal that is euphemistically referred to as gender affirming care, because if you want to understand the medical scandal currently unfolding in gender clinics, you have to understand the group that sits at the very core of it, and that is WPATH.
Thank you,
Did that
Maya.
answer the question? Okay.
Yeah, that's a great introduction. One of the first questions that we have is, how do you think that transgender identity came to be regarded as a natural variation akin to homosexuality, for example, rather than as a mental disorder? And what have been the repercussions of that change in perspective?
Hey, it's a really good question. So it all rests on this, honestly, I think. So one of the greatest victories of the gay rights movement was when gay rights activists succeeded in getting homosexuality removed from the DSM. It was actually the DSM-2 at the time. Gay rights activists, the gay rights movement had got started, and then they actually, I think they sort of stormed a meeting of the American Psychiatric Association in 1970, and it was a very short campaign. 3 years later, the APA voted to remove homosexuality. So homosexuality was no longer considered a mental disorder. And the reason that the activists did this was because they saw that it was stigmatizing. To have homosexuality in the DSM was stigmatizing. As well, I mean, what's the point? Why would it even be in there? There's no point to it even being in there. And so trans rights, many people I'm sure will have noticed that trans rights models itself on gay rights. The whole trans rights movement looks an awful lot like gay rights on the surface. If you don't look too deeply, it looks exactly like gay rights. It's got the rainbow flags, it's got the pleasant sounding slogans, it's got the fighting for a supposedly oppressed minority. So trans activists decided very early on that they wanted being transgender. At the time it was gender identity disorder or transsexualism even, they wanted it removed from the DSM. So they wanted to frame being transgender as this healthy, natural, normal variation of human existence. But they faced a problem that gay rights activists didn't face, and that's the fact, obviously, that on the one hand, they were campaigning for increased access to hormones and surgeries on demand, while at the same time trying to take the diagnosis out of the DSM. And that was impossible to reconcile. If you want access to hormones and surgeries covered by third-party insurance, you absolutely must have a DSM diagnosis in order to get it reimbursed. And so WPATH was central to this. It's called the Psychopathologization campaign. So WPATH became WPATH in 2007. Stephen Whittle was the president at the time of this big change. I'm sure many people in England know who Stephen Whittle is, a trans-identified female. And so they go on this, they come up with something, it's actually brilliant. As much as I dislike the organization, they came up with a brilliant solution to this impossible problem. And at the time, the diagnosis was gender identity disorder, which focused on the identity as being the disorder, the body and mind not being aligned. It's the identity that is the disorder. And so WPATH and all the trans activists, they came up with the idea, and they lobbied the APA for this, that they would shift the diagnosis to gender dysphoria. And then the focus of the diagnosis becomes the discomfort that you feel because your body and mind are misaligned. The identity is perfectly natural and healthy. The disorder is the discomfort that you feel. And as soon as they did that, they made it so that the treatment is not targeted on reconciling body and mind. You can't do anything about that. In fact, you have to celebrate it. You have to celebrate the fact that some people identify as members of the opposite sex. That's a good thing. And what the treatment must then focus on is alleviating the discomfort by bringing the body in line with the mind. And from that point on, we entered the era of affirmation, affirm the identity, and then medicalize the body. The only thing you can then do is provide hormones and surgeries on demand, because it becomes a human right to alleviate your distress, to alter your body with hormones and surgeries. And it prevents getting to the heart of the problem. It prevents exploring, why is this person convinced that they're a member of the opposite sex? Where has the misalignment come from? All of that was basically relegated to being akin to conversion therapy. It's bigotry, it's transphobia, and medical intervention is the only option from then on.
Yeah, that's so frightening, isn't it? It's so true. We've all seen it, where you've got parties supporting bans on conversion therapy, and we don't have a big problem in the UK with traditional conversion therapy for homosexuals. You know, it's not really happening here. I mean, it might be different in the US or whatever, but this whole ban on conversion therapy is directed just at the trans lobby, and it's really scary.
I think what's happening now as well is that it's awful to use the word traditional conversion therapy. My understanding of it is, almost sometimes electric shock therapy, sitting in a room and being spoken to for hours and hours on end, almost, sort of military style torture. But now it's coming into documentation where the words exploratory therapy are now put in sort of coattailing and being teamed, I suppose, into the terminology of conversion therapy.
I would just point out, we have the conversion therapy ban. I live in Canada, so we had a conversion therapy ban, and it's precisely that. Gay conversion therapy was not a thing in Canada, so we banned something that already had not been happening for decades. But it was entirely trans activists wanted full unfettered access to hormones and surgeries on demand. So they made everything that didn't fit that demand, they made that conversion therapy, and then it got written into law. So it's completely, and the irony, you must point out the irony that, of course, when you ban exploratory therapy, or you make exploratory therapy and psychotherapy akin to conversion therapy, a whole group of vulnerable adolescents who would otherwise just grow up to be gay and lesbian adults, if they could just be left alone to accept their sexuality, grow and mature, they get swept up into this medical scandal, and they have their bodies medically converted with hormones and surgeries. It's the darkest of ironies.
Yeah, that's true. This next question leads on. It's about the medical model. Traditionally, we have a medical model where a patient has something wrong with them. They go to the doctor diagnoses it and tells them what's wrong and tells them what the treatment is. But now we have this contrast with the sort of service user model, in which a client goes and tells a doctor what service they want and what treatment they desire. Which, if you're going to go and get a nose job or a boob job or something like that, that's a service model. And this sort of whole trans ideology seems to fall somewhere in the middle. And is that what you see? And I think one of the issues is that parents and people who are concerned are going along and they're expecting a medical model and being treated on the basis of a service model. Do you want to comment on that?
Right. I mean, if it sits in the middle at all, then it sits very much towards the service model end of the middle. I would put it basically, to me, WPATH, certainly the affirmative model of care, WPATH's brand of gender medicine it's the service model. It's consumer driven, extreme body modification on demand, with no science to back it up. It's an experiment. They don't have anything that resembles real science to back up what they're doing to any of these patients, to be honest. And so you're right, though, in that, yes, parents certainly expect when they show up to a gender clinic, a pediatric gender clinic, there, you see, what's weird is their child will have self-diagnosed. And it's not really a self-diagnosis. It's more they've self-identified as transgender, most likely because they've spent way too much time immersed in gender ideology online or at school or in peer groups. We'll get to social contagion soon. So the child comes out as trans. The parent unsuspectingly takes the kid to a gender clinic, expecting exactly that, the medical model. The physicians, the therapists, the doctors, the endocrinologists, whoever the child ends up with, they expect them to do a differential diagnosis. They expect them to explore, figure things out, not understanding what the affirmative model is. The affirmative model is the child walks in, has declared that they are transgender, and that comes with immediate affirmation and right away, of course, a diagnosis, an official diagnosis of gender dysphoria. And then from the diagnosis of gender dysphoria, because of WPATH and because of their affirmation only approach, there's nothing else that the doctors can do. They can only offer hormones and surgeries as hormones, puberty blockers, hormones as the first line of treatment, because attempting to help the child reconcile with their birth sex, that is now considered conversion therapy. So, I mean, in the WPATH files, there is the extreme end of this consumer-driven body modification, and that is when you get into the realm of non-binary surgeries. I don't know how many people have read the report or the files, but this is non-binary surgeries are the end. I would hope they are the end point of having no guardrails around these people. And so they are creating second sets of genitals for people who identify as male and female. They're nullifying the body, making smooth, sexless bodies for people who identify as neither male nor female. This is not even an experiment. Nobody is monitoring or checking or like measuring which outcome is better, which surgical technique, nothing. They're just experimenting on these people because they want it, because the people walk in and say they want a second set of genitals, the surgeons give it to them.
That's just really crazy, isn't it? But Jess, do you want to ask a question?
I think the more that I hear, the more difficult I really find it to even be, sort of more even-handed, I suppose, because when I found out about what they call the neurosurgeries, and I asked, I was sort of, what's a neurosurgery? And they said, well, effectively making a person's body look like Ken and Barbie. They called it the Ken and Barbie surgery. And I couldn't even fathom how that would work. So I still become flabbergasted. But I'm thinking about this next question here. I suppose a lot of these will all tie in and probably double up. But it says here that there seems to be a high percentage of WPATH members who are activists as well as being medical professionals. It is difficult when reading the WPATH files not to regard these people as grossly uncaring and reckless with the lives of their young patients. Is this characterization unfair? And what is the motivation of these doctors and surgeons, do you think? I mean, it's a difficult question, isn't it? Because I'm thinking, I'm sure at some point, and when we get onto social contagion, I was looking at all the history of that. I think a lot of these things perhaps start off with the best of intentions, and then they just run away with themselves. And I don't know. Over to you, Mia. Right.
So WPATH, when it was before it was WPATH, the organization was called the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, HIBIGDA. And when HIBIGDA first started, I would say that they did set out with good intentions. This was a very obscure field of medicine, and they, in their own way, they were trying to help the people who had a deep-seated discomfort with their sex body for whatever reason, and there are many reasons why that could be. And then as in the sort of, I would say, mid to late 1990s, as the trans rights movement is starting to really gather strength and become bigger, trans activists start to join HIBIGDA. And from that point on, the goals of the organization are political goals. But it's difficult. I think everyone in there from that point on, they're not setting out to harm anyone. There are a lot of transgender members who really do think that hormones and surgeries are the key to happiness, and that every trans identified person, every person who has this mismatched gender soul residing within them, will achieve peace and happiness and a lifetime of they'll thrive for the rest of their lives if they have access to hormones and surgeries. And so when the organization has that mindset, they become fixated on one track, and that one track is access to hormones and surgeries on demand, and they view safeguarding, guardrails and safeguarding, as being an obstacle that gets in the way of transgender people finding, peace and happiness in their altered bodies. And so WPATH then campaigned to remove all safeguarding. They view safeguarding, guardrails, as transphobic. They call it gatekeeping. They view gatekeeping as transphobic. But at this time, we're talking the first decade, the 2000s, maybe into the 2010s. It's a very different patient cohort, because the modern trans rights movement has yet to go in full force, launched into the public sphere. And so we do not yet have the social contagion of what I use the term rapid onset gender dysphoria. I know it's a contested term, but whatever you want to call it, the social contagion that kicked off around 2014, 2015, we do not yet have that. And so perhaps WPATH and its, desire to remove all guardrails and to increase access to hormones and surgeries, maybe that would not have been so catastrophic if it had not met the social contagion, which we saw the explosion of adolescents identifying as transgender. But because the two things did meet, we really do have an actual medical catastrophe on our hands. But the individuals within WPATH, there may genuinely be the occasional sadist, the occasional person who is in there because they want to ruin lives. But I think actually the vast majority are far more dangerous, because the vast majority are good people. I hesitate to use that word, but they're well-intentioned people on an ideological quest to save people, to improve the lives of all of the patients that they serve. And they cannot see the harm they're doing because they are on this ideological quest. And I think there's truly, to me, nothing more frightening than a fanatic armed with a scalpel who cannot see the harm that they're doing.
Yeah, that is so true. And it is frightening, because it is so easy to fall into the idea that these people must be evil, but obviously they're not. They are thinking that they're doing a good thing. I've had a couple of people ask what the DSM is. Could you just explain what that is, please?
Okay, that is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It is the American Psychiatric Association's Bible, basically. It's the American Psychiatric Association is obviously American, but the DSM is now used globally. It's used internationally. There is an equivalent. World Health Organization has an equivalent, the ICD, the International Classification of Disease. But I think the DSM is more commonly used everywhere.
on the back of what you said about the WPATH, I was just wondering, it's notable that they are quite reluctant to talk about detransitioners. And as detransitioners, do they create a big problem for WPATH?
Yeah, so the WPATH files, there's parts of I had been writing about WPATH for a long time and watching them and reading about them. So I knew what WPATH was before I embarked upon the report. But there were certain parts of the WPATH files that really upset me. And the detransition part was probably the part that upset me the most because yeah, obviously the existence of detransitioners are living, breathing proof that gender affirming care sometimes causes harm. And of course, when you are in an organization that has been pushing gender affirming care, so-called, relentlessly and pushing for the removal of guardrails, pushing for the removal of safeguarding, it's very difficult to be confronted with the idea that you've caused harm. And so, of course, the detransitioners cause massive cognitive dissonance in anyone in WPATH. And you can see that in the way that they talk about detransitioners. So they'll, first of all, they often trivialize it. So they'll talk about how it's just another step on the gender journey. And, you know, as if no mistake has been made. Okay, yeah, they transitioned and they had body parts chopped off, and now they're now they're going on to the next step, and it's nobody made a mistake. But then Marcy Bowers is in there. Now, Marcy Bowers is the current president of WPATH. He's a trans-identified male, and he's the one actually that botched Jazz Jennings's vaginoplasty that was filmed and broadcast to like millions of people in the reality TV show I Am Jazz. But Bowers is in there, and there's a couple of comments that he makes, one of which is, he says, you know, people have to own and take active responsibility for their decisions, particularly when they are permanent, irreversible medical decisions. And this is the part probably that enraged me the most, because Bowers is the head of the organization that for the last 15 years, at least 20 years, has been advocating for the removal of all the guardrails from this experimental treatment protocol. And then thousands upon thousands of innocent young people come stumbling along, tumble into the abyss, have their bodies irreparably harmed by the doctors in WPATH and all those who follow WPATH. And then at the end of it, the president of the organization says, well, it's your fault. You've got to own and take active responsibility for the decision that you made, totally oblivious to the fact that all of the blame lies on the shoulders of Bowers and all of his colleagues. But then there are other, they also, you see, the scientific literature does say that, you know, that they'll fall on studies that say, oh, there's a less than 1% regret rate. And, you know, there are studies that say that. Absolutely ludicrous, appalling science. The way they frame detransition, they frame it in such a way that it basically excludes almost everyone who has ever detransitioned. And they'll say, you know, more people regret knee replacement surgery than phalloplasty, which is when they make an appendage out of a woman's forearm, sew it onto her groin and call it a penis. And my point is, that's a massive red flag. If more people do regret knee surgery than phalloplasty or vaginoplasty, that something is going on there. And I think that something is the sunk cost fallacy. This is, we all know that the more you put into something and the more difficult it is to achieve something, the less likely you are to admit that it was a mistake, the less likely you are to face up to the mistake that you've made, especially if you cannot turn back the clock, okay? The power of irrevocability. If you can't turn back the clock, you're going to be powerfully psychologically motivated to continue to convince yourself that you made the right decision. And so if you've put your fertility into a decision, if you've put body parts, your chance of intimacy, I think you're going to be powerfully motivated to continue to tell yourself that you don't regret it, even if you do. And studies will show that. There was one, the original lesbian. She was just a lesbian who was the patient zero of the child adolescent transition scandal. She basically went through the process, had hormone surgeries, something like phalloplasty, but not quite the full arm thing. And at the end, at about age 30, they asked her, you know, how she was doing. And she was lonely, she was isolated, she was depressed, but she still didn't regret her transition.
Yeah, that's so sad. I mean, the idea that we've forgotten that young people are supposed to be exploring and changing, and you concretize something like doing these awful surgeries on them, etc., and concretize that when we know they're not developed. It's shocking, really. But I shall hand over to Jess. Do you want to talk about social contagion, Jess?
Yeah, I was just thinking about some of our listeners, and I just wanted to sort of just a couple of minutes just to put a little bit of padding around some of the terminology. So people might have heard cognitive dissonance, and that really is, if you like, competing drives of two ideas in the brain or more, and you literally take the path of least resistance. That's kind of the theory, that you cannot cope with it, so you just go down the easiest path of least resistance. That's ish in a nutshell. When I'm thinking about social contagion, sort of certainly online or in discussions I've had, people have sort of found it a bit difficult to take because they find it a pejorative, because they think it means sort of diseased. And I think it's important to say that there is a difference between social contagion and contagious disease. It's equivalent to saying that somebody's laughter is infectious. It's that kind of thing. So, but originally around the sort of late 1800s, a chap called Gustave Le Bon came up with the notion of behavioral contagion, and he was looking at crowd theory, so early sociology, about observable, this is all up for debate, obviously, but observable behavior of people who, you know, the madness of crowds, people coming together. So this then moved through to the notion of social contagion around the 50s. And social contagion looks at how social and attitudinal changes move through societies really rapidly and rather quickly. And they take hold in, we call them crazes or fashions and so forth. But if you think about way back, even Plato had this idea of mimesis or mimesis, and you can see the word mime in that word. And if we fast forward again, you look at people like Richard Dawkins in The Selfish Gene, he came up with the notion of the social mimesis, if you like, the mimetic. So how things move through society. Why? There's various theories. Maybe it's an evolutionary protection, that we all crowd together and we all follow a single idea because we're protected in that way. Examples that, again, people are welcome to look up is the spinning diseases that happened around 15th, 16th century, where people literally spun themselves to exhaustion. More recently, I was reminded of the indigo child, the rise of the indigo child in the 60s, and then the revision in the 90s, where these children were seen as sort of somehow super empaths. And I just recently found out that one chap who was involved in indigo children actually came up with the term of gender switching through a process called creon. Look it up. It's just quite amazing how these things take hold. So just before I ask the question, thinking about institutions, you might have heard me use the word runaway diffusion. Again, this is more science-based, it's more to do with chemistry, but it's moved across. It's almost like the social contagion of institutions, how ideas, the frontal lobotomy, thalidomide, all of these things, they're innovations without checks and balances, and they literally take hold and move through institutions really rapidly. And when you think about lobotomy, again, this person was doing it for the best of reasons. I've got his name here is Antonio Monitz, who was a neurologist trying to help people. But if you look up the actor Francis Farmer, you see that it was the craze. He even got a Nobel Prize, and then suddenly, bam, it stopped. So hopefully that's a little bit of a background for our listeners for the next question, which is, what part do you think social contagion plays in the current and historic medical scandals, Mia?
I think it plays a huge part. Social contagion's been my thing for a long time, on Twitter, certainly. It's, to me, one of, when I first discovered this issue, the J.K. Rowling tweet, December 19th, 2019, shortly after that, a few days after that, I think, I came across the most startling graph that it just transformed everything for me, because I saw it was the referrals to the Gender Identity Development Service, the GIDS clinic in the Tavistock in London. And it plotted referrals. And, you know, from 2010 to 2014, it's very low and there's almost no referrals. And then 2014, it just shoots up, just exponential growth on the graph. The vast majority were adolescent girls, teenage girls. And when you're faced with something like that, if you're looking clearly, if you don't have rainbow goggles on, if you're not ideologically motivated and you just look at that graph, the first thing you realize is this is an epidemic. This is a social contagion. And then as I was reading into it, I realized that we were basically inside the GIDS clinic and inside gender clinics everywhere, and the wider society, we were all ignoring the social contagion. We were pretending that the social contagion wasn't happening. We were pretending that this sudden growth was a positive thing, because all of these children and adolescents were supposedly coming out because societal acceptance. Society was finally ready to accept them for the members of the opposite sex that they always were, and therefore they were all coming out. And then the Lisa Littman paper, I read about that, which in 2018, Lisa Littman was a researcher at Brown University, and she came up with the theory of rapid onset gender dysphoria, because she had seen in her community one girl after another announcing a transgender identity, coming out as a boy, basically out of nowhere, and then medically transitioning with puberty blockers, hormones, and surgeries. And she thought, like any decent researcher would, what's going on here? She looked into it and she came up with the theory that this is not entirely peer influenced, but strongly peer influenced. This sudden meteoric surge in numbers has got something to do with peer influence, because, you know, sometimes it's 2 or 3 or 4 girls in the same high school year coming out as trans all at the same time, after they've spent an awful lot of time online immersed in gender identity ideology, watching trans influencers. And it shouldn't have been controversial. It should have been. And she was not saying, I have found the answer and this is what it is. She was saying, I think that this might be what's happening and we should do further research. It should not have been controversial. And yet it was. They absolutely ruined her. They viciously attacked her. She lost her job, and they retracted the paper on a technicality, nothing more. And I realized that something is going on here. This is not how research is typically done. And so for me, I decided to look into other social contagions, first of all. The most striking one that I've written about is the contagion of bulimia in the 1980s. So bulimia was included in the DSM-3, which was published in 1980. And when it was included, it attracted the attention somehow of, you know, women's magazines, and the women's magazines ran features on bulimia. And so the idea that you could binge and purge, you know, it's described in the DSM what the symptoms of bulimia are. The idea that you could binge and purge entered the minds of millions of women, teenage girls and young women. An idea like this has to land in fertile mind. And so the idea that you could binge and purge landed in the fertile mind of teenage girls and young women all over the world. And by the mid-1990s, a disorder that prior to its inclusion in the DSM was practically unheard of by the mid-1990s, I think 30 million people had been diagnosed. It was a global contagion. When Princess Diana went public with her struggle in the early 1990s, she was also obviously a victim of the social contagion. There was another spike in numbers, and there was another surge in teenage girls, predominantly teenage girls and young women suffering from bulimia. We've seen it with cutting. We've seen it with anorexia. We've seen it. An almost perfect example is multiple personality disorder in the 1980s. This disorder that was entirely created by psychiatry, created by very misguided therapists, was unleashed into society. You could have multiple different people living within you, switching between the 2 or 3 or 16 people inside you. That was a type of person. It spread via talk shows and through communities, and then it disappeared because it was a medical scandal. There were lawsuits, and it disappeared. So it's not even new. We've seen so many social contagions all throughout history, psychiatric epidemics. And you're right, the word contagion does have negative connotations, and it's not negative. Ideas and emotions and behaviors are contagious. And it doesn't have to be a negative thing. It's just if the behavior has a detrimental effect on your health or your psychological health, then it becomes a public health emergency. And that's what we have on our hands right now. And I think more people are understanding that this is a contagion now than when Lisa Littman tried to raise the alarm in 2018. But it's the most obvious social contagion in all of history. It's time we faced up to that.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, it is reading your work, reading the WPATH files. I really recommend people to go and take a look. But the 4 examples that you give of previous medical scandals in history, they are quite shocking. And I'm surprised, they're not things that we hear about, really. We've heard about the lobotomies. Most people or a lot of people will be familiar about that. But the craze where they took women's ovaries out, they removed women's ovaries because they thought that would cure their mental health problems. And after reading what you've written, it wasn't just a few people, it was hundreds of people that they did this to. And it is quite striking. One thing that did strike me is you're right, this usually arises in teenage girls, because then there are reasons for that, about teenage girls being very social, and as you say, with fertile minds. But it's also that it seems to be played out on female bodies, the lobotomies, the ovarectomies. It's happening to women. And I don't know whether there's a reason for that, but it just struck me that was happening.
Well, I mean, certainly ovariotomy at the time, the surgeons and the doctors were all men, and women's reproductive organs, women's reproductive systems were somewhat mysterious, and they had been blamed for everything for a long time. Everything that ailed a woman was because of her wandering uterus and whatever. But I think, can you imagine a parallel in which, men's psychological troubles are all put down to his penis? It would never happen. It just could never happen. But ovariotomy, that's another social contagion. I'll just go into that one because it's my favorite. It's my favorite part of the whole WPATH Files report. And it's the biggest medical scandal of the 19th century. And it's when surgeons the doctors became convinced that the ovaries were the source of madness in women, that it was based on an entirely pseudoscientific idea of reflex theory, in which one organ they thought could create inflammation and symptoms in another organ in the body, like they were connected through the spinal cord. There was no truth to it, of course, but that didn't stop them running away with this theory. And when they developed anesthesia and surgical techniques, they were, I think, kind of anxious to try them out, and they got a bit swept up in the excitement. And so when they implicated ovaries in mental illness, they started to remove the healthy ovaries of women as a remedy for their mental distress. But a crucial part of it is, as is always the case, that because mental illnesses evolve with culture, they evolve with leaps of technology, they evolve with advances in medicine, the women at the time were imbibing the narrative of reflex theory, then they were becoming convinced that their ovaries were the source of their mental distress, and then some would actually show up asking surgeons to remove their healthy ovaries. And if they didn't die, because in the early days of this experiment, this scandal, 30% died, because this is before antibiotics and surgical cleanliness. But if they didn't die, many of them declared themselves cured because of the power of the mind, you know, the placebo effect. They went into it thinking that their ovaries were the source of their mental distress. They had their ovaries removed and they declared themselves cured. And it's very chillingly similar to now. It sends a chill down my spine, because in the WPATH files, I wrote about a surgeon who was talking about removing the healthy ovaries of 20-year-olds. And these are 20-year-olds who have, you know, these are young women who have imbibed the narrative of the modern trans rights movement, that they are, all of their mental distress is a sign that they are transgender, and all they need to do is take testosterone, have their breasts cut off, have their ovaries removed, and then they will be cured and they will live a long and healthy, happy life. But the thing is, in the 19th century, when they first started the ovariotomy scandal, they didn't know what the ovaries did. And so after they had removed a woman's ovaries, they were baffled as to why she was displaying symptoms of menopause and she couldn't conceive a child. But now the WPATH surgeons, and all like them, they know exactly what the ovaries do. They know exactly what they're taking from these young women. And they also know exactly what health problems they're setting these young women up for, because they're putting sometimes teenage girls, women in their 20s, into the menopause, knowing all of the health problems that these young women are going to face throughout their lives. It's unforgivable.
It is. It really is shocking. And talking about, you know, the medical industry, we've had a few questions about the profit motive, and how much this is a driver of what's going on. You know, what is the relationship between the pharmaceutical companies and WPATH? And someone else has asked, if it's a service model, how do insurance companies pay for this? You know, and also ultimately, will the money side of it, will the insurance companies be what brings it down in the US if they stop paying for this? So yeah, have you got any idea about the relationship between WPATH and the pharmaceutical companies, and who's making money out of this?
Well, I know we've had lots of revelations about WPATH recently in the Alabama case, the unsealed documents. And one was that in the standards of, so WPATH is up to standards of care version 8. They call them standards of care. They're not really, there's no standards, and it's not care. It's a very ideological document. But yeah, they didn't even look at conflict of interest for the standards of care committees. They didn't even look to see who, and basically they're all, if they're American, they're all making money on this medical experiment and these treatments. So again, I always come back to that. I really think the driving force is ideology. There's definitely a financial component. People are making money on this. But I really do think that ideology is what drives it. These people actually do believe in these gender souls. They really do believe in the concept of transgender children. And they really do believe that medical transition is the only answer to help these poor transgender people for whom life is very difficult. It's they probably at some point they probably have financial, I would say they definitely have some financial incentive, but the main reason is they are seized with the justice of this movement and they are on a quest to make the world a better place. I do think that. But as for the service model, Standards of Care 8, WPATH Standards of Care 8, is a remarkable document in that everything in there is defined as medically necessary. Basically, the way it works is if the patient wants it, it's medically necessary. And if it's medically necessary, insurance companies have to cover it. And that's basically all Standards of Care 8 is. It's not that we know from the unsealed documents as well, but we've known this for a while, that there's no science there. They've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of citations, and it's all junk science. There's no control groups. There's no long-term follow-up. There's nothing that resembles a real scientific study in any of the citations. But we know now as well that they commissioned systematic reviews, and then they didn't like the from Johns Hopkins, and then they didn't like the results, so they just suppressed them, don't release them. And so they have no respect for the scientific process. The Standards of Care basically exists just to define every single procedure as medically necessary, including, I hate to go back to this, but it's important to understand that, so including the non-binary surgeries, this is the second set of genitals, or the nullification. These are defined in WPATH's non-binary chapter of their Standards of Care 8. They're defined as medically necessary, and Canada provides you with the example of how dangerous that is it's been quite well publicized now, but here in Ontario, we have a very, very mentally unwell man who identifies as non-binary, but with like a feminine dominant identity or something. And so he wanted to have a surgically created vagina, but keep his penis. Normally they invert the penis when they create this open wound that's supposed to resemble a vagina. He wanted to keep his penis and have the surgically created vagina using a section of his colon. And he argued, first of all, our health insurance denied that. We said that they wouldn't pay. The provincial health insurance would not pay. So he appealed, and the basis of his appeal was that forcing a non-binary person to go through binary surgery was a form of conversion therapy under our conversion therapy ban. And the health board ruled in his favor. And one of the reasons they ruled in his favor is because WPATH says that this surgically created colon vagina is medically necessary for people who identify as non-binary. Now, in what mad world could that be medically necessary? And there's no science to back this up. This is truly into the realm of Frankenstein surgery here. There's no evidence to say that this is safe, that it's going to improve his health. I would say it's probably not going to improve his health, his mental health, or his life, and it's probably going to make his life a whole lot worse. But because WPATH, they just declare everything medically necessary, and then insurance has to cover it. Oh, and the last point. Yes, I do think health insurance companies could bring this down. And I think what's happening in the United States, because we've got, like, the US and Canada, we're very different to Europe. We're not moving in the right direction at all. And so what's happening in a couple of states, they have, because the statute of limitations to sue for malpractice is normally like a year or 2 years. And of course, detransition takes on average 5 to 8 years, which is why we have so few lawsuits, because they're just not detransitioning in time. And so a couple of states have increased the statute of limitations to 30 years after 30 years after the young person turns 18. This is for children. So that means they have 30 years to bring a lawsuit. And that right there, I think, even without malpractice lawsuits being won, that right there is going to make insurance companies very uneasy, because they know that there's a very good chance that these doctors are going to be sued. And as well, it also I think if you are so convinced as a gender doctor that you are getting it right and you are helping, you really have nothing to worry about. Everybody's going to live happily ever after. It's the way to do it.
Yeah, yeah, and it is slowly happening. You mentioned the lawsuit. What that is about is, if I can go into that briefly, but I'm sure you'll know a little bit more about it than I do, Mia, is that the Alabama has now banned surgery and hormones for minors. And as part of that lawsuit, there's been a lot of revelations from WPATH papers that have really shown that the whole sort of scientific evidence base is non-existent. And actually, if you really believe this ideology, you don't really need a science base, because it's a belief system. It's like if you went to church and someone said, well, what is the test for if God exists? Well, you don't need it because you believe this stuff. So really the science bit didn't matter, but it is coming out, through that lawsuit and through, as you say, the Johns Hopkins University were supposed to be looking at this evidence base for WPATH. And WPATH wanted to control the outcome of that. They wanted to have the final say over what Johns Hopkins University kind of released. And you can't do that with science. You can't. And the other thing I'd just like to say over the back of what you said is, I think it's very true that I think it was Helen Joyce that said, that brought up the idea that because so many young people in particular are so online all the time now, we have young people that are not really in touch with their bodies because they're online. They have an avatar, and an avatar you can pick and mix whatever you want. And it's almost like they're doing the same with their bodies. It's like a meat sack that they can do anything with, which is a real problem, I think. So, Jess, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to address listeners who are piling in loads of questions into the chat. And in fact, actually, we will not get around to all of them, but just so that people know that we've sort of covering them. We've had a message from a trans widow, which is probably a whole webinar, I think, by itself. We couldn't do that justice here. So what we're going to do is we'll keep all the chat, all the questions. People have mentioned John Money and the experiment. I've also thinking about Robert Hogue, who was the creator of the trans flag. What else have we got here? Just so that people know. People were talking about the overrepresentation, or implying that there's an overrepresentation of people. They're called intersex and mentioned hermaphroditism, but it's now obviously variations and disorders and differences of sexual development. Again, we could probably have a whole webinar on each of those. Please rest assured that we have taken note and we will do our best. And obviously you can stay in touch with us and we can have some ideas for further webinar. What I did want to mention was that from that runaway diffusion through institutions, sort of picking up, and then obviously Emma, go with another question. We've got time. But I was looking at the institutions where that exponential rise that happened. You could almost match it for the lobotomy as well, where you had 20,000 people suddenly being lobotomized, predominantly of the male batch of people who were lobotomized. Gay men figured highly in lobotomization, and women overall figured the highest. When we're talking about money, again, we could look this up and double check, but I've heard figures in Europe alone on the mainland is 25 billion euros we're looking at. This is how much money is sloshing around in the industry. So I'm trying to piece all this together in my mind. So I'm thinking about the institutions with the rise of the Dutch protocol. And apparently I didn't know this either. It came from three clinicians out of Utrecht and Amsterdam. That took over. Sweden, the Karolinska, again, everyone, will make sure that you get all the information. And then in Finland and in Norway, and then almost in reverse, it started to collapse as people started questioning. And I've got here the name of the doctor called Dr. Kaltiala from Finland, was suddenly going against all of the protocols that had been followed before and questioning everything. And suddenly the pack of cards started to fall down. And of course, we have the Tavistock with David Bell and Sonia Appleby, Professor Sonia Appleby, and Kirsty Entwistle. So yeah, I just wanted to segue that in because you can see the rise and fall in the institutions as well. It's quite phenomenal. Thank you.
I'd just like to comment on Kaltiala. So Kaltiala was the clinician who brought puberty blockers to Finland. But she is one of she shows how it's supposed to be done. So she faced up, she saw the changing cohort, she saw the social contagion, she saw that these kids were not the kids that the Dutch had based their whole very dubious experiment on, and she immediately started investigating what's going on. And there are a number of really good studies that she did early on looking into it, and then Finland did a systematic review, found the evidence to be exceptionally weak, and Finland was the first to reverse course on this. That's how it's supposed to happen. At the Tavistock in London, obviously you had the meddling of Susie Green, a woman, the head of Mermaids, who transitioned her own child. So that was a very political movement, meddling in the medical care of children. And in the US and Canada, we are entirely political. Nobody is, even now to this day, no one in Canada, as far as I know, has even paid any attention to the Cass review or anything that's happening in Europe.
Yeah, thanks. That's another one of the questions, Mia, was what is there a difference between WPATH and EPATH? Am I right in thinking that WPATH is the world one and EPATH is the European one? Do they run parallel? Do they have a separate kind of identities?
Oh, they're very much interlinked. Yeah, it's the regional WPATH, basically. So when you join WPATH, you instantly get membership to your regional path, your regional version of WPATH. So there's EPATH for Europe, OzPath for Australia, PATHA for New Zealand. CPATH is the Canadian one. It's not very active at all. And there's US Path. It's obviously the biggest because most WPATH members are American. And yes, you instantly get membership. And from what I know of the various other regional paths, they are very much the same as WPATH. There's no evidence that they are in any way less ideological or more evidence-based. I've never seen any evidence of that.
Okay, thank you. And just we haven't got much longer, but so I'm going to try and get a couple more questions in. Been really interesting so far, but this one. A comment in the chat is trans children are a justification for a male sexual rights movement. Now, the whole fetish side of the trans movement is a very tricky one. How does WPATH deal with that? Do they acknowledge it? I mean, especially given the eunuch files, if you'd like to say a couple of words on that, because this is something that trans ideology shies away from, shall we say. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, it's complicated, but sure. So I'm completely with whomever asked this question in that the concept of the trans child is new. It only sprang into existence in the 2000s. And it's basically, it comes from gender identity ideology. If what makes a person transgender is a mismatched gender identity, and that means they push this idea that everyone possesses a gender identity, and it is your gender identity, your inner feeling of gender, that makes you a man or woman, boy or girl, and your body is irrelevant. And because we all possess a gender identity, therefore we have the concept of the transgender child. You can have a child with a mismatched gender identity. That's their ideological way of thinking. And I think they love this concept of the gender identity because it sanitizes what is actually the main driving force behind men who identify as women. And that is a paraphilia called autogynephilia, which inside WPATH does not exist. WPATH does not accept that autogynephilia is real, even though a large percentage of the trans-identified male members are themselves autogynephilic men, I'm sure. And this is because autogynephilia, I love the quote in Helen Joyce's book Trans. She interviewed Ray Blanchard, and Ray Blanchard gives the most perfect quote of why we are forbidden from talking about autogynephilia, why trans activists hate it so much. And it's quite simple. And it's, if a man comes into work dressed as a woman one day, it's much easier for him to say, I'm coming to terms with the fact that I've always been a woman on the inside. And it's quite another thing for him to say, I've moved on from just masturbating, wearing women's clothing, to wearing them all the time. One is more socially acceptable. One is easier to sell as a rights movement. And so, yes, we've got, because it's a very complicated, I don't want to go on for too long, but because we are denying what's really causing people to identify as members of the opposite sex, we're just pretending that it's all to do with this mismatched gender essence that resides within some people. We therefore, children are being sacrificed, I think. They're being told that they are trans kids. They're being given puberty blockers and hormones, basically because a whole bunch of men cannot face the reality of their paraphilia. It's a very dark idea, but I do believe in essence it's true. Eunuchs, I mean, what can I say about eunuchs? You see, there have been many, there's the WPATH files, there's the releasing of the documents in the Alabama case, but predating all of this, there was the eunuch chapter of their Standards of Care 8. And at the time of the eunuch chapter, that was September 2022, I recall thinking, oh my goodness, they'll never survive this. How can you survive as a respected medical organization when you put an entire chapter about eunuch as a valid gender identity that even children apparently can possess in your guidelines? And so the fact that they survived it shows what kind of mad moment in history we are living through, where you can take a castration fetish. These are men who have castration fetishes. You can slap a gender identity label on it, put an entire chapter in your Standards of Care saying that these men with eunuch gender identities deserve to have gender affirming hormonal or surgical castration, and still your organization doesn't collapse.
Yeah, you're right. It is quite shocking, the eunuch, that whole eunuch file thing. It's so transparent, isn't it? Right, we're nearly out of time. We've just got a couple of minutes left. So really quickly, do you expect to see any of these people in prison? Do you think that they'll be charged with criminal activity at any point? What's going to be the outcome in a few years' time down the road?
Right. Okay. I think this all the time. This is a very difficult debate to be a part of, and I try to maintain my composure. And every now and again, when I come across phalloplasty, or I see that TikTok surgeon with, posing with the girls with their mastectomy scars, I just think, these people belong in prison. I really do think that any surgeon who has ever performed phalloplasty, any surgeon who has ever stripped a mentally ill woman's forearm and turned the skin and flesh into an appendage and sewn it onto her groin, I think any surgeon who's ever done that should actually go to prison. I don't think any of them will. I think the best we can hope for is that they will be struck off, and I actually don't even think that's going to happen. I did for a while. I was trying to find examples of doctors who went to prison for their crimes. In the hormone scandal of the 1940s to 1980s that I wrote about in the WPATH files, where they were giving growth hormone to short boys, but they were taking the growth hormone, they were just taking pituitaries from corpses, harvesting them from morgues, grinding them up and basically injecting the hormone into the boys. They gave a bunch of the boys Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease, a terrible prion brain-eating disease. Many of them died. In France, three doctors and four pharmacists, I think, faced criminal charges of manslaughter for that. But remarkably, were not found guilty. They were found to have been acting with the best medical knowledge of the time, and they were exonerated. There was a surgeon from the Karolinska Hospital who has been did receive a prison sentence for a crazy experiment on patients that he was doing trachea transplants, and it was absolutely wild. He was convicted and has not yet gone to prison. It's very rare that there will even be criminal charges, but this is a medical scandal that the likes of which we've never been seen before. The level of fraud that we are now just about getting a glimpse of with these unsealed documents in the Alabama case. Maybe some people will be charged based on that because they actually were tampering with the systematic reviews and trying to suppress the evidence, and children have been harmed as a result. I don't know, but certainly some people do belong behind bars.
Yeah, I have to agree. And I must say, just reading the WPATH files, I just take my hat off to you for being able to absorb all of that and to kind of put it out in such a calm way. It really is a good read. But I'm sure many of us are eaten up with this similar kind of feeling of that anger of what's gone on. Okay, well, it's time is getting on, and I'm afraid we're going to have to end here.
Oh, sorry, Emma, if I could just say thank you to Green Women's Declaration for inviting me. I wasn't sure if I was going to make it, but it's been an absolute pleasure co-hosting, and to meet you, Mia, in the flesh. It's just, I'm astounded. I've got a lot of food for thought, a lot of it really challenging, but thank you very, very much, both of you, and to our listeners, of course.
Yeah, and Mia's done several other interviews. I highly recommend going and looking at her work there and following her on Twitter. So thank you once again, and thank everyone else for coming. It's been amazing. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you so much.